Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come on," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink, crying out, "Lord, save me!" Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. So why do we have miracles? Is it so that Jesus can prove that he is God and do all these crazy tricks and then we'll go, "Yeah, I want to follow him"? No, Jesus was already God. He didn't need to prove anything to us. Is this like an audition where if Jesus gets on sort of a God's Got Talent program, then we'll really trust him when we see what he's doing? No, because God is not like a magic act on America's Got Talent or American Idol. No, miracles are designed to reveal God's character more clearly to us, things that we may not have ever noticed about who God is, because now we can see who Jesus is. And then miracles cause us to trust. To trust, yes, in him, not because he can do all these crazy things, but because when we trust, we are obeying him no matter what he does, even when we're in the midst of a storm. And when we trust, we not only learn to trust him, but we also learn to trust the church, his community of followers. Let me give you an example of how that really happened in Matthew chapter 14. Jesus told his disciples to get into a boat and go out on the Sea of Galilee. It's a lake that's even smaller than Lake Michigan. You could just about see, in fact, you can see from one side of the shore to the other. And what happens in the middle of the Sea of Galilee is something rather normal. Storms come up, just like in life. There are always storms. And Jesus does something that Jesus has done before. While they are out in the boat, Jesus actually walks on the water to them. He has done this before. He's not trying to prove to them that he's God. He is God. But then something interesting happens that actually reveals that the disciples don't really trust that he's God, and that they are full of a very insecure, negative kind of doubt. When they look out onto the water, they think Jesus is a ghost. And so, in order to find out if Jesus is really Jesus, Peter says to Jesus, "If it's really you, tell me to come to you." Well, Jesus calls Peter's bluff. Peter gets out of the boat. He starts walking on the water, and then Peter really reveals how feeble his faith is. He starts looking around at the storm. Jesus watches Peter, and then Peter starts to sink. He quickly grabs him by the hand, yanks him up out of the water, and says, "Oh, ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" That kind of doubt is that negative kind of doubt of double-mindedness, of lack of loyalty, of not really trusting in Jesus as God, and being distracted by all the storms and waves around you rather than placing your trust in Jesus. Well, when they get back in the boat, the wind dies down. Now, why would we need this miracle? Jesus can obviously walk on the water. Jesus can calm the storms, but he doesn't make the storms go away. No, Jesus is teaching the disciples two things. The first is, whenever we're in a storm, we can always trust that Jesus will come to us. When we place our faith in Him, we can trust that it might appear that Jesus is not on the way, but He's always right on time. But then the second thing that we can learn is we can trust the people in the boat with us when we're in the boat with other disciples. You see, the boat, which is all throughout this story, is really a picture of the church. The disciples are learning to row and to work together. Jesus wants Peter not to be a Superman, not to be spectacular, not to get out of the boat and abandon his brothers that are there rowing with him, but to stay put and to help the team. What good is a boat if one of the rowers abandons ship? You see, what Peter learns very quickly is only God can walk on water. And Peter is not God. But if he stays in the boat and works with the other disciples, Jesus not only comes to them, but he wants to get into the boat in the middle of the storm with them and help them get to the other side. So what about you? You know, sometimes when we're in the middle of a storm, there's a temptation to be like Peter. One, to sort of abandon ship, to give up, to drop out of the church. Or to be the superhero. I'm going to run off and do something spectacular just in case Jesus doesn't show up. Jesus doesn't need superstars, and he doesn't need unloyal disciples. What he needs is people who are willing to stay put, with the community around them, to listen, to row, to work together, to trust, to pray. Jesus is on the way, and yes, the storm will subside, but the storms don't go away. No, the storms are part of life, and Jesus will be the one who will row with us to the other side because he gives us community to help us. When I was in 7th grade, I had an experience somewhat like Peter. Not exactly rowing in a boat, but I did experience an emergency. You see, my mom and I lived on about 1.5 acres, 2 acres of largely uncleared land in a rural part of Pensacola, Florida. My dad had died 2 years previously, and my mom and I made it our job to clear off the rest of the land. I was an only child, and so this was our project during the spring months when it was very dry in Escambia County, Florida. We would go out with what was basically just small tools, and we would whack away at the weeds and the large overgrowth that were all around our property. It gave us something to do, especially during spring break. We didn't have a lot of money, and it was a way for us to just put ourselves to good use, and my mom would take a few days off work, and we actually had a good time. We would take all the brush that we had cut down and place it in a burn pile, and there, because we were out in the county, we just light the brush on fire. But on one particularly dry day, the fire left the burn pile and began to spread like a ring of fire out into the backyard. Through my 7th grade eyes, it looked like an inferno. We did not quite have enough of a garden hose to reach out to the extended ring of fire. We didn't quite plan ahead for this very well. Well, my mom was a little concerned, so I ran inside and I dialed 911 and called the fire department. But then, instead of going back out in the backyard to help my mom stamp out the fire or to try to extend the garden hose, I decided to be the superhero. I climbed aboard a riding lawnmower, which was a very slow tractor, and started driving as a 7th grader out the driveway, down the street to look for the fire department. Well, much to my amazement, the fire department never came. And what seemed to be about 30 minutes later, but was probably just about 10, my mom came driving down the street with a very frustrated look on her face, wondering why in the world had I left her and that I was going to get myself killed driving down the street in a riding lawnmower. I asked her what happened, and she said, "I'll tell you what happened. The neighbor came over." And by the time I got back, I found that Mr. Edens, who was living right across the street, had also viewed the fire. He like Jesus, knew to come in a time of need. He snapped off a piece of pine straw right off a pine tree, and he literally stamped out the fire by hand. And by the time I arrived back home, the storm was gone and everything was fine. And then we went down to the hardware store and just bought a longer garden hose. Now here's my problem. In the middle of an emergency, I did the one thing you're not supposed to do. I left, thinking that I could go solve the problem myself. Instead, if I had just stayed put, help was really on the way from a neighbor who cared enough to watch and, like Jesus, knew when to come when things were bad. You see, you can trust that Jesus will come to you in the storm. And around you in your herd, you can actually trust in the church. Because wherever 2 or 3 or 10 are gathered together in Jesus' name, He is there with you. So would you obey? Would you trust in the storm? In the middle of the storm, Jesus is on the way, and He will guide you safely to the other side.